What really happened behind the infamy of the Tiger tank, and why did it cost the lives of so many of its own crews? Why do we still talk about it with such intensity, even 80 years after its brief time in service? And why is the real story far darker than it seems? Here you'll see the other side of the medal, behind what is arguably the most famous tank in history. Let's start from the very beginning. It was August 1942 near Leningrad when the Red Army would face for the first time a new German tank that was unlike anything seen before on any front with the Germans. Just weeks later, British and American forces in North Africa would have the same experience. It would kick up the dust that probably still lasts to this day, which confuses the real picture of this tank painted to be indestructible in World War II. However, the real story is much more complicated and darker, especially for their crews. The invasion of the Soviet Union underestimated the strength of their army, and especially the power of Soviet tanks at the time. German Panzer III and IVs were unexpectedly outclassed by T-34 and KV-1 tanks, which the Germans didn't know even existed, and surely not in such numbers. Their armor and firepower were significantly more powerful than German tanks at the time, so this sparked an urgent need for a new tank. Although Panzer VI was already being developed after encountering trouble with heavy French tanks in isolated cases early in the war, the Eastern Front put that on the top priority list. To not bother you with development, eventually Henschel's prototype was chosen, becoming much better known as the Tiger I. It now cost and weighed more than double the Panzer IV, but despite that, Hitler ordered 1,500 units immediately, believing that their wonder weapons in the hands of elite units would just crush the Allies. Little did he know that just over 1,300 units would be made before everything fell apart. The arrival of the Tiger on the Eastern Front was so shocking because the Germans had kept its development in utmost secrecy. However, the Soviets were about to find out in one engagement when the Germans were trying extremely hard to recover one disabled tank that at first glance from a distance looked like a Panzer IV. But this one was different. Germans were frantically trying to tow it away, but a Soviet commander noticed this and quickly sent a group of 4 tanks with infantry to sprint in under the cover of artillery, capture the tank, and drag it to their positions. This was the first time the Allied side even saw what was the new German tank that would become so notorious. It was just the right time for the Soviets to examine the Tiger and its weak spots before the upcoming battle at Kursk. The first couple Tigers that saw combat outright terrified Soviet tankers in a couple of engagements when they destroyed them with a single hit, far beyond the effective ranges of any other German tanks at the time. However, the Germans were not showing in their propaganda movies the challenges that heavy tank battalions that got Tigers were having, significant mechanical issues and trouble even deploying the tank into combat. As with many German weapons that were developed during the war, they were rushed into combat by Hitler's impatience with not enough testing. So the transmission failures, engine fires, and other problems caused by its subtle 56 tons were only the beginning of their problems waiting for them. Now, going back to combat, the first 4 Tigers were delivered to the Eastern Front for combat testing, and their debut was actually a complete disaster. They bogged down in soft, muddy terrain, and their interleaved overlapping road wheels got clogged with mud and debris. 2 of them broke their transmissions, and a third lost its engine. Although not lost to enemy fire, they now required immense effort to pull out and drag back for repairs. New parts had to be flown in from Germany, and Tigers got repaired and ready for the next attempt at battle a month later. Spoiler alert, this one was even worse. All 4 Tigers now either broke down or got stuck, with one catching fire on top of that. This time, 3 Tigers were recovered, while one simply couldn't be pulled out. After weeks of attempts, it was destroyed by the Germans to prevent it from being captured by the Soviets. This actually marked the first total loss of a Tiger tank. The problem was, early in the war, the Germans actually didn't have a proper way to recover stuck Tigers. Even towing them with other tanks was forbidden because of the risk of damage to the engine and transmission. There were specialized recovery vehicles for this, but they were scarce, and it took at least 2 of them to even attempt to recover a Tiger. Although this bad beginning wasn't the end of bad fortune for Tiger crews, they did learn crucial lessons on what to correct and improve. In the Third Battle of Kharkov, Tiger tanks would be for the first time deployed in significant numbers, better organized, and now really spreading terror through the Red Army. Here, they began to earn their fearsome reputation as they crushed Soviet lines and showed what they could really do. Now, at the same time, on the other side of World War II, the Western Allies were about to have their own first encounter with the new German tank. Western intelligence intercepted some German messages about the new tank and also heard from the Soviets about this earlier encounter. However, what was an additional shock was that this tank they heard about was designated the Panzer VI, but the latest known German tank was the Panzer IV. It turns out that the Panther, which was Panzer V, was actually started before the Tiger. But because the Tiger was based on the already familiar Panzer IV concept, it arrived faster and saw action first. The Panther needed more time because it was built using entirely new technology. You'd understand the Allies' concern about this, where your enemy now has two completely new tanks, and you know nothing about either of them. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel received around 20 Tigers to support Germany's desperate attempts to stop the American and British advance across Libya and Tunisia. In their first action there, 3 Tigers advanced through the olive grove, using the cover to surprise and attack M3 Lee tanks at a range of under 100 yards. They knocked out 2 Lees, while the Tigers received several non-penetrating hits from point-blank range, which boosted the crew's trust in their tank. However, this was going to change very soon, as the initial shock faded and the Allies began to find solutions for the heavy German tanks on all fronts. Understandably, Allied tankers were horrified by the appearance of a new tank that ate all their shells unharmed, while their tanks got destroyed by it at any range. They didn't know there were only 20 of them, and because from a distance the Tiger resembled the Panzer IV, they were usually misidentified by the fearful eyes of terrified Allied tankers. Similarly to the Soviets, the Allies would finally get a much-needed close look at the Tiger when a column of Churchill tanks was ambushed. Several lead Churchills were hit when one returned fire, hitting the Tiger's gun mantlet and embedding into the turret ring, jamming the turret. Another hit wounded the Tiger's commander, and the crew bailed out of the tank in panic and left it almost intact. That was the now famous Tiger 131, the only operational Tiger in the world today. Now the Western Allies had the chance as well to study it and find the best ways to counter it. Tiger's box-shaped armor was a major advantage early in the war. Its thick, flat plates could stop most Allied anti-tank weapons at the time, and the box structure gave much more space inside the tank for more ammo and fuel. But as newer enemy tanks and more powerful guns started arriving on the battlefield, the problems with flat armor became more obvious. That's why the Germans later switched to sloped armor on tanks like the Panther and the Tiger II. Sloped armor increased the effective thickness and made enemy rounds more likely to bounce off. Tiger crews were trained to compensate by angling their tank about 30 degrees toward incoming fire when possible, but in combat, you couldn't quite choose the angle of engagement. Another huge problem was the quality of the steel. By 1944, Germany had a severe shortage of manganese, which was crucial for producing strong armor that wasn't brittle. They started using lower quality substitutes, and as a result, the armor became extremely brittle, with sometimes entire plates cracking or collapsing, sending shrapnel flying inside the tank into the crew compartment. And you could imagine what would happen to them when hit by razor-sharp hot metal splinters flying at supersonic speed. There were also several known shot traps on the Tiger. One of them was the rounded gun mantlet. When hit, it could deflect a shell downward straight into the turret ring, jamming the turret or even blowing it off completely. The commander's cupola was another weak spot, as it was mounted high and barely welded onto the turret. So in combat, Tiger crews had to work around their flaws while the Allies tried to exploit them. One of the biggest flaws was the turret. It weighed over 11 tons and needed a full minute to complete a rotation. For comparison, the Sherman could do the same in just 15 seconds. Allies also found another answer to fight heavy German tanks: air superiority. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt or the British Typhoon were now hunting tanks from above. Tigers were big, slow, and impossible to hide once spotted. Their top armor was thinner, so fighters' rockets, machine guns, and bombs could take them out easily. Once the Luftwaffe was pushed out of the skies, Allied aircraft had a free hand. If a Tiger was caught out in the open, it usually didn't survive. At the same time, Germany was struggling to keep production going. We already talked about manganese, but there were other shortages too, basically everything else. Rubber was one of them. Some tanks were deployed without rubber linings on the wheels, squealing metal on metal that could be heard before they were even seen. A big problem for crews was that Tigers were basically hand-built, and there weren't many interchangeable parts. If something broke down in the field, it became a nightmare to fix. Training quality was getting worse as well. In the final years of the war, many Tiger crews had little or no proper training. They didn't know how to handle the complex engine and transmission, and inexperienced drivers damaged their own tanks just from poor handling. The Maybach engine was originally rated for 3,000 RPM, but had to be limited to 2,600 to prevent damage. That made the already slow Tiger even slower. Most of the Tigers were already much used and worn out. As the railway network was being destroyed by the Allied bombing campaign, Tigers had to go on long marches under their own power to reach front lines. Then they were thrown into collapsing front sections to try to plug the gaps. Allied tanks were getting better, and more powerful guns were appearing across all fronts, while Tigers were ever more often deployed without any real plan, without support, and with barely enough ammunition and fuel to fight. Sometimes they were given just a couple of shells per tank. Spare parts were almost impossible to get, and once a Tiger broke down or got damaged, there was a high chance it had to be abandoned, and in most cases, it was the crew who destroyed it. More than half of lost Tigers were actually destroyed by their own crews blowing them up to prevent capture. The numbers tell the rest of the story. Just over 1,300 Tigers were ever produced. They were credited with destroying around 10,000 enemy tanks, which, even if half of that is true, is an astonishing kill-to-loss ratio. But the Allies, although having inferior tanks on paper, had tens of thousands of them. The Tiger remained a tough and dangerous tank to the end, even for the new Allied tanks, but there were never enough of them to make any difference. For every one Tiger, there were 10 or 20 enemy tanks that had enough fuel, ammo, and support. And that's why so many of its crews never made it home.